Okay, now the next section that we're going to go into is how to actually take the pictures. So like I said, I'm using a Nikon D7500. You don't have to use that. I think Nikon 5000 series are good cameras. Canon makes a lot of good cameras. I'm not familiar with Canon cameras. And this camera is not modified at all or anything. Like I said, I use this Tamron 70 to 200 millimeter lens, usually all the way out at 200 millimeters. Given this is an APS-C camera, it's an effective focal length of 300 millimeters. But the settings that I use are, and this lens is a f2.8 constant aperture, so I have it all the way open at f2.8. And the ISO I normally use is 6400. When I took the Pleiades, I use ISO 5000. So your camera needs to be kind of able to accommodate that. And then the last thing that you need to set is the shutter speed. So that means you're going to have to put your camera in manual mode. You can't have it in automatic because you have to set these settings. So one, mount your camera on a sturdy tripod. Again, I want to reiterate that. Use manual mode. Set your camera white balance to daytime or daylight. That's what most people recommend. Shoot in RAW and not JPEG. So shoot in RAW, not JPEG. And use manual focus. So that means you're not going to use autofocus because at night your camera is not going to focus anyway. So what you do is use live view. Turn live view mode on so the screen on the back of the camera will come on. And to focus, what you do is you try to find a bright star in the sky. And you use your live view, maybe focus in, magnify one time or so, and turn the manual focus wheel until that star is as small as you can get it. And then hit the magnify button again, maybe once or twice, so zoom in on the star, and then tweak the focus, so turn the focused ring again until the star is as small as you can get it. So that means your focus is locked in, and then try not to bump or disturb or move that focus ring. Okay, now so one, try to shoot as wide open as your lens can get. That means the largest aperture, the largest opening. Like I said, you probably want to have f2.8 or f4 as the highest number. Again, now how do you determine the, and I said ISO 6400 or ISO 5000. Now how do you determine the shutter speed? So there's something called the rule of 500, which determines how long the shutter can be open based on the focal length of the lens before you get star trailing. Star trailing means that the stars will start to form lines or streaks. They won't be round. So you divide the focal length of the lens that you're using into 500. So for example, if you're using a 50 millimeter lens, I divide 50 into 500, it's 10. So that means I can shoot for 10 seconds with a 50 millimeter lens and before I get star trailing. Say if I use 250 millimeters, I divide that into 500, that only gives me 2 seconds. So I can only shoot for 2 seconds before I get star trailing if I use 250 millimeters. The thing you got to be careful about though, if you have an APS-C camera, you have to take into account the crop factor. So for example, I'm shooting at 200 millimeters. I can't divide that 200 into 500. I have to multiply the 200 by the 1.5 crop factor to get 300, and then divide 300 into 500. So that will give me the more accurate number. So when I'm shooting at 200 millimeters here, That's actually 300 millimeters effective focal length. Divide that into 500. I can only shoot for, I've been shooting for 1.6 seconds. 1.6 seconds. So again, I normally shoot f2.8 aperture, ISO 6400, although I've also shot 5000 one time, and I shoot at shutter speed of 1.6 seconds. And what's going to happen is, so I get the object centered in the live view screen, have all my settings, the focus is set up like we talked about. The star that I focused on before is as small as possible. I position my camera to the object that I want to take the picture of. I center that in the screen, and I just start taking snapshots with the remote shutter. I hit it, and maybe wait 2 seconds before you take another picture for the vibrations and camera shake to settle down before you hit take the next picture. And take maybe 10 to 20 shots, because what's going to happen, the object is going to start to move across the screen. So before it moves too far, like I said, maybe up to 20 shots maximum, then just unloosen the knobs, move the camera, recenter the object in the screen, and then start taking shots again, another 15, maybe 20 shots. See how far it's moving, and it depends on the focal length you're using. For me, at 200 millimeters on this, every 10 to 20 shots I have to recenter. If you're maybe using 50 millimeter lens, you won't have to recenter quite as often. Again, on your camera, make sure you turn off vibration reduction on the lens. On the lens, turn off vibration reduction. I learned this the hard way. I had vibration reduction on, and I noticed when I went back in the house, looked at the images, some were tack sharp, the stars were round, and then I'd get a batch of pictures where there was trailing, and then I'd then take some more shots, they were okay. Man, this drove me crazy. I didn't know what was causing that. I thought something maybe was wrong with the lens, or I was taking pictures too quickly, not allowing the camera to settle down. But then I realized I had vibration reduction on. As soon as I turned that off, that solved the problem. I had heard and read about turning off vibration reduction if you have your camera on a tripod, but I didn't really think that much of it, or that it would cause that big of a deal. But I think especially here in this situation at this long of a focal length and trying to focus on stars, yeah, it made a big difference and caused a big problem. So turn off vibration reduction, turn off long exposure noise reduction in your camera, because what that does, I think it makes your, when you take a picture, it takes twice as long, because it's taking dark shots from what I understand. But you won't need that, because we're going to take calibration frames, which I'm going to talk about. So turn off long exposure noise reduction. High ISO noise reduction, I think doesn't matter if it's on or off. What I've read, that only applies to RAW files, so that's not a big thing. And finally, what you're going to need to do is take calibration frames. So there are 4 types of frames: light frames, dark frames, bias frames, and flat frames. So your light frames are just your regular pictures that you're taking of the object, of the stars or the galaxy or the nebula. That's just a light frame, just like we're doing here. Set the aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and just take the pictures. But we want to take something that's called dark frames. So dark frames is, the settings are all the same on the camera that you have with the light frames. Only difference is you just put the cap on the lens so that it's totally dark, and you take maybe 10 to 20, I think, dark frames. think I take normally about 20 at least dark frames, or 25 dark frames. And then for bias frames, you leave the cap on the lens and you just change the shutter speed. Everything else stays the same. You change the shutter speed to the fastest shutter speed your camera has. For mine it's 1/8,000th of a second, so I just change the shutter speed and just click off 25 shots. Again, you don't have to maybe use 25, you can use 15, 20. So the last type of frame is called the flat frame. What I do is I take my camera, let's see here, turn this, I just point it straight up in the air like this. I have an iPad mini and I put it on the note, so I just have a blank white screen. I just place the iPad mini on top like that. So the camera is just taking a picture of a blank white screen. Maybe some people say place a blank sheet of regular copy paper first and then place a light source on top. And then change the camera mode to aperture priority and keep the settings the same. And what's going to happen is take 25 shots, and that's going to the camera's going to adjust and the shutter speed accordingly, and that'll get the histogram right in the middle. And you might be asking, hey, what's the reason or purpose for taking these what we call calibration frames? So let me screw this back down first. So we take the dark frames because it removes, so in the camera there is a chip, usually CMOS chip, and the dark frames removes the CMOS dark noise or the dark signal from the light frames. The dark signals are magnified by temperature, exposure time, and ISO. So basically, dark frames are capturing the thermal noise that's produced by the camera. And this is due to the sensor, the CMOS sensor heating up. The bias frames remove the CMOS chip readout noise from the light frames as it reads the values of each pixel of the sensor, and that's called bias. So it's removing the readout noise, or the frames will remove the readout noise. And the flat frames correct for vignetting and uneven field illumination created by dust smudges in the optics of the camera itself. So what we're going to do, and this will go on to the next phase of the video, is that we take the lights and we're going to use a program which is called Deep Sky Stacker. Well, let me mention one thing before. I didn't mention, when you take the light frames, I take 300 to 400 light frames. I would suggest taking 400 light frames, and you may say, hey, whoa, that's a lot of frames, but remember, depending on the focal length, at 1.6 seconds, taking 400 light frames is really not that long. It is a investment in time. So I take 400 light frames, 25 dark frames, 25 bias frames, and 25 flat frames. So what we're going to do, we're going to take all of these frames, or all of these different shots, if you want to call them, and load them into a software program that's free called Deep Sky Stacker. And you can look that up on the internet and just download that. So what's going to happen is I load the light frames up, and then the dark frames you load up, and that thermal noise that the dark frames capture, Deep Sky Stacker removes that thermal noise using the dark frames. Deep Sky Stacker removes readout noise that's captured in the bias frames, and it also removes the vignetting, or say dust spots, that captured in the flat frame, so it really makes your images look better. I know at first I think I just took light frames and dark frames because I didn't want to hassle with the other frames. If you want to just try that, just do the light and darks. But now I take all four, and they really, because the bias frames don't take long because the shutter speed is so quick, you can rattle those off in 10 seconds. Flat frames don't really take that long because the shutter speed is pretty quick as well. So now that we got all these pictures, the four different types, lights, darks, bias, and flats, you go into Deep Sky Stacker, open that program up, and load. See if I'll try to find a video of, or you can look on the YouTube of how to use Deep Sky Stacker. It's not really that difficult. But what I do, I download the pictures from the camera onto a hard drive, and I put each type of photo in a separate folder. So I have a folder for light frames, folder for darks, folder for bias, folder for flats within, say, a folder for Andromeda Galaxy. I open them all and open Deep Sky Stacker, and then I load each one right after the other. And then there are the various settings that you have to apply in Deep Sky Stacker. It can be a little bit confusing, but like I said, look for a video on how to use Deep Sky Stacker. And then, and it may take a little while because it's going to have to process these 400 photos or however many lights you take and darks. So it may process for 45 minutes to an hour, so just let it run. Then what's going to happen, it's going to produce a 30 autosave file. It's named autosave. It saves it in your folder where your light frames are. It's going to be a 32-bit TIFF file. And if you use, I use Photoshop to process, since I'm a photographer, I already had Photoshop. But Photoshop can't really work with a 32-bit TIFF file, so you can open that file in Photoshop and convert it to a 16-bit TIFF, or when you're in Deep Sky Stacker, do kind of a save as and save it as a 16-bit TIFF file. And when you save it, make sure you check the box that says Embed Adjustments in the saved image, but do not apply them. And then when you go into Photoshop, you need to process and what's called stretch the image. And that means using curves and levels in Photoshop to pull out the detail, because the file that you get from Deep Sky Stacker is going to look very dark and it won't seem to have hardly any information in there. You'll be saying, hey, what is this? I can't see anything, but there's information there. You just have to pull it out. There's certain optional add-ons that you can use in Photoshop. One I kind of highly recommend is called Gradient Exterminator. It's about 50 bucks. You might say, hey, that's a lot of money, but to remove gradients in these astrophotos, I found it just something you really need to have, because trying to remove gradients otherwise can be somewhat difficult. There's something else called the Astronomy Tools Action Set. That's like about 22 bucks. And then I also have Topaz Denoise, which I use for my regular photography. I already had that, but these are optional. But what I could recommend, a good Photoshop processing YouTube video, and this will be in the description as well, is called Photoshop Astro Imaging Basics, Levels and Curves, and this is by a lady by the name of Carol Pope. And then also a more in-depth video is called How I Edit My Deep Sky Images, and this is called by /Astrophotography Tutorial, that's the name, by Astro Addict, and he has a YouTube channel. And his is a little bit more involved, so I suggest you maybe look at that and other videos on YouTube. Again, hopefully this will be a good introduction for you. Maybe you want to try this out and see that you can take images of deep sky objects without having a star tracker. And like I said, I took Andromeda Galaxy, Orion Nebula, and the Pleiades. Again, hopefully if you like this video, hit the like button, leave a comment below, tell me what you think, and if you tried this out, got some results, I'd love to see what you came up with. So again, hey, thanks for watching, and good luck. Of that.